Imagine walking into a school where every glance feels like a judgment, every whisper hides a cruel remark, and the people meant to protect you are the ones tearing you down. For Layla Carter, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was her daily reality. When she transferred to the prestigious Greenwood High, she hoped for new opportunities and a fresh start. Instead, she found herself drowning in an ocean of hostility, with even her teacher turning against her in ways that were unthinkable. The tension between belonging and rejection pushed Layla to her breaking point, sparking a chain of events that would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire school. Before we dive into this powerful and gripping story of resilience and change, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you're moved by Layla's journey, don't forget to subscribe. As the moving van pulled away from the neatly trimmed yard, Layla stood in the driveway, clutching her backpack with both hands. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, were practically beaming as they admired their new house, a two-story home in the heart of Oakwood Heights, a prestigious suburban neighborhood. This was supposed to be their family's fresh start. "Look at this place, Layla," her mother said, her voice filled with pride. "Quiet streets, excellent schools, this is everything we've worked for." Layla forced a small smile. She wanted to share their excitement, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Oakwood Heights was different from any neighborhood she had lived in before. The sprawling houses and manicured lawns radiated wealth and exclusivity, but to Layla it felt isolating. She hadn't seen a single person who looked like her during the drive-in. "This is going to be great," her father said, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You'll make new friends in no time." Layla nodded, but her mind was already racing. The thought of starting over at a new school filled her with dread. Greenwood High School, one of the top-rated schools in the state, promised countless opportunities, but Layla couldn't shake the feeling that she wouldn't fit in. The next morning, Layla walked into Greenwood High for the first time. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the towering doors. The hallways were wide and gleaming, bustling with students who seemed to know exactly where they were going. Laughter echoed through the corridors, but none of it felt inviting. As Layla made her way to her first class, she couldn't ignore the subtle glances directed her way. A group of boys standing by the lockers whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward her before breaking into laughter. Layla's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, clutching her books tightly against her chest. She found her first class, history, and slipped into a seat near the back. The teacher, Mrs. Benson, was tall and commanding, her piercing eyes scanning the room. "Class, we have a new student today," she announced, motioning to Layla. "Introduce yourself." Layla stood, her palms damp with sweat. "Hi, I'm Layla Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A murmur rippled through the room. From the corner of her eye, Layla saw two girls in the back row smirk and exchange whispers. One of them, a blonde with a perfect high ponytail, rolled her eyes. "Well, Layla," Mrs. Benson said, her tone clipped. "Take your seat, and let's get started." Layla sank back into her chair, wishing she could disappear. Throughout the class, she felt the weight of eyes on her, every laugh or whisper seeming sharper and louder than it should have been. When the lunch bell rang, Layla hesitated outside the cafeteria. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, scanning the crowded room for a friendly face. Spotting a table with a group of girls who seemed deep in conversation, she mustered her courage and approached. "Hi, is it okay if I sit here?" she asked, her voice soft. One of the girls, the blonde from history class, barely glanced at her before shrugging. "Sure, whatever," she muttered, turning back to her friends. Layla sat down, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. She tried to follow the conversation, but the girls ignored her completely. After a few minutes, they shifted their chairs slightly, as if unconsciously moving away from her. "Does she not get it?" one of them whispered, loud enough for Layla to hear. "We don't want her here." Another girl laughed, her voice dripping with mockery. "This is going to be fun to watch," she muttered. Layla's appetite vanished. She stared at her food, pretending not to hear, but her chest tightened painfully. She felt like an outsider, a stranger who didn't belong in their world. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discomfort and unease. In every class, Layla felt the same cold stares and dismissive whispers. She tried to remind herself that this was just first-day jitters, that things would get better once people got to know her. But as she walked home that afternoon, her heart was heavy with doubt. Her parents greeted her eagerly when she walked through the door. "How was your first day?" her mother asked, her smile warm and hopeful. "It was fine," Layla lied, forcing another smile. She didn't want to dampen their excitement or make them worry. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Layla replayed the day in her mind. Every comment, every laugh, every glance felt magnified. She wondered if she had made a mistake coming to Greenwood High, but deep down, she knew she didn't have a choice. "I just have to try harder," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "Things will get better." But the knot of anxiety in her stomach told her it wouldn't be that simple. Layla woke up the next morning determined to push aside the unease that had lingered from the day before. She carefully adjusted her school uniform and tied her curly hair into a neat bun, hoping to blend in more. "This is a new day," she whispered to herself as she grabbed her backpack and headed out the door. The halls of Greenwood High were just as busy as the day before. But this time, Layla kept her head down and avoided eye contact. Her first class was history again, and she hoped to make a better impression on Mrs. Benson. As the lesson began, Mrs. Benson started a discussion on ancient civilizations. Layla, eager to prove herself, raised her hand to answer a question. "Yes, Layla?" Mrs. Benson said, arching an eyebrow skeptically. Layla took a deep breath and began explaining her thoughts, but midway through she stumbled over a word. Her cheeks burned as she tried to recover. Mrs. Benson sighed loudly, shaking her head. "If you don't know the answer, Layla, don't waste the class's time," she said, her tone sharp. Layla's heart sank as a ripple of laughter spread through the room. She looked down at her notebook, her confidence shattered. The rest of the class dragged on painfully. Every time Mrs. Benson spoke, Layla felt her eyes linger on her, as though waiting for another mistake. When the bell finally rang, Layla hurried out of the classroom, desperate to escape. At lunch, she wandered through the cafeteria again, scanning the tables for a friendly face. This time, she decided to sit at an empty table near the back, avoiding the group from the day before. She unpacked her sandwich, trying to focus on eating, but the noise around her felt deafening. A group of boys at a nearby table caught her attention. One of them, a tall, red-haired student, nudged his friend and whispered something, glancing in Layla's direction. The friend smirked and said loudly, "Didn't know they let anyone in here now." Layla froze, her appetite vanishing instantly. She pretended not to hear, but her hands trembled as she packed up her lunch. As she walked to her next class, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, hoping to avoid any more attention. But just as she reached her locker, a voice called out behind her. "Hey, new girl." Layla turned slowly to see a group of girls standing a few feet away. One of them, a blonde with icy blue eyes, smirked as she leaned against a locker. "What's with the attitude? Too good to talk to us?" the blonde asked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Layla swallowed hard. "I'm not trying to be rude," she said softly. "I just don't want any trouble." The blonde laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Trouble? Please, you're not even worth our time." The girls giggled and walked away, leaving Layla standing there, her face hot with embarrassment. The rest of the day was no better. During a group project in her science class, Layla was assigned to work with 3 students who clearly didn't want her there. "Let's just get this over with," one of them, a boy named Jacob, muttered as they sat down. Layla tried to share her ideas, but Jacob cut her off immediately. "We don't need your input, okay?" he said with a smirk. Another student, a girl with curly blonde hair, chimed in, "Yeah, maybe stick to what you're good at if there's anything." Layla clenched her fists under the table, fighting back tears. She focused on her notebook, scribbling down notes to distract herself from the cruel words. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the day, Layla felt completely drained. She hurried home, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Greenwood High. At dinner that night, her parents chatted excitedly about their new jobs and how well everything was going. "What about you, sweetheart?" her father asked, smiling warmly. "How's school?" Layla forced a smile, pushing her food around her plate. "It's fine," she said quietly. Her mother frowned, studying her face. You sure? You've been so quiet since we moved here. I'm just tired, Layla replied quickly. There's a lot to get used to. Her father nodded sympathetically. That's normal, Layla. Starting at a new school is always tough, but you'll find your footing soon. Just give it time. Layla nodded, but deep down she wasn't so sure. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed the events of the day. Every cruel remark and dismissive glance felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. I just need to get through tomorrow, she whispered to herself. Maybe things will be better. But, as she closed her eyes, the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Layla woke up the next morning, the dread from the previous day weighing heavily on her chest. She took extra care getting ready for school, smoothing out her uniform and redoing her bun twice. They just need time to get used to me, she told herself, trying to muster courage. Today will be different. But as she stepped into the bustling hallways of Greenwood High, the familiar feeling of unease crept back. She adjusted the straps of her backpack and hurried to her first class, hoping to avoid any more confrontations. Layla's history teacher, Mrs. Benson, was already writing on the board when she arrived. Layla slipped into her seat, avoiding eye contact. We're going to start with a group discussion, Mrs. Benson announced, turning to face the class. She began dividing the students into groups, and Layla found herself paired with Jacob, the boy who had dismissed her in science class, along with two other students who barely acknowledged her existence. Layla hesitated as she joined them at their table. Maybe if I just focus on the work, they'll leave me alone, she thought. The group began brainstorming, and Layla cautiously offered a suggestion. What if we start with a timeline of events, and then… Jacob rolled his eyes dramatically. Oh, great. Another genius idea, he muttered sarcastically. The girl next to him, Emily, smirked. Yeah, thanks for your input, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. But we've got this under control. Layla clenched her jaw, the familiar sting of rejection washing over her. She stared at her notebook, scribbling aimlessly to hide the tears threatening to spill. By lunchtime, Layla's resolve was wearing thin. She wandered the cafeteria, clutching her lunch tray tightly. Spotting an empty table near the back, she quickly sat down, hoping to avoid further humiliation. As she unwrapped her sandwich, a group of boys walked past, their laughter ringing out. Careful, don't sit too close, one of them said loudly. She might start talking to you. The others laughed, and Layla felt her face flush. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her food, but the comments echoed in her mind. Why does it feel like everyone is against me? She thought bitterly. Later that afternoon, Layla's worst fears came true during gym class. As the students lined up to play volleyball, the coach asked them to form teams. Layla hesitated, watching as the others quickly grouped up, leaving her standing awkwardly on the sidelines. Guess I'm stuck with her, a girl named Brianna muttered as she reluctantly motioned for Layla to join her team. Throughout the game, Layla could feel the icy stares of her teammates every time she missed a shot or failed to keep up. Brianna's irritation boiled over when Layla fumbled a serve, sending the ball flying out of bounds. Are you even trying? Brianna snapped, her voice cutting through the gym. I'm sorry, Layla stammered, her cheeks burning. Maybe you should just sit out, another girl added, shaking her head. Layla felt the tears welling up again, but she bit her lip and stayed silent. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. After class, Layla hurried to the locker room, desperate to be alone. She sat on the bench, her hands trembling as she fought back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The school day dragged on, each class feeling heavier than the last. Mrs. Benson continued to call on her in history, but her tone was always condescending, as if she expected Layla to fail. Layla, Mrs. Benson said during a discussion on ancient Greece, do you even understand the question? Maybe you should review the material again before speaking up. The class chuckled quietly, and Layla felt her stomach twist. She wanted to defend herself, to show that she had studied and knew the answer, but the words wouldn't come. That evening, Layla sat at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. Her parents chatted about their day, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. How was school, Layla? Her father asked, his tone upbeat. It was fine, Layla said quickly, forcing a smile. She didn't want to burden them with her struggles, not when they were so proud of her for getting into Greenwood High. After dinner, Layla retreated to her room and closed the door. She sat on her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. "Why do they hate me so much?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Her thoughts spiraled as she replayed the day's events, the harsh words and dismissive glances piling up in her mind. She wanted to tell her parents, to let them know how much she was struggling, but the fear of disappointing them held her back. "They worked so hard to get me here," she thought. "I can't let them see that I'm failing." That night, Layla barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories of the day came rushing back. Jacob's smirk, Brianna's glare, Mrs. Benson's cutting remarks. "I just have to keep going," she told herself, her voice barely audible in the darkness. It has to get better. It has to. But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure. The next week at Greenwood High pushed Layla closer to her breaking point. The dismissive comments, the isolating glances, and Mrs. Benson's constant belittling continued to chip away at her self-confidence. One afternoon during history class, Mrs. Benson announced a group project that would span the next 2 weeks. "You'll each be assigned a topic to present to the class," she said, scanning the room with her usual no-nonsense glare. "I expect everyone to contribute equally. No excuses." Layla held her breath as Mrs. Benson read off the groups. When she heard her name, her heart sank. She was paired with Jacob and Emily, the same students who had dismissed her ideas during a previous assignment. Layla approached their table hesitantly, clutching her notebook. Jacob groaned audibly as she sat down. "Great," he muttered. "Guess we're stuck babysitting." Emily smirked. "Maybe she'll surprise us," she said mockingly, her tone laced with sarcasm. Layla ignored their comments and tried to focus. She opened her notebook and began jotting down ideas for their project on the Industrial Revolution. "I think we could start with," she began, but Jacob cut her off. "Why don't you just let us handle it?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "We don't need any extra help." Layla clenched her fists under the table, trying to stay calm. "I just want to contribute," she said quietly. "Contribute?" Emily scoffed. "Maybe you could fetch coffee or something." The two of them laughed, and Layla felt her face grow hot with humiliation. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to stay silent, knowing that anything she said would only make things worse. When the bell rang, Layla gathered her things quickly and left the classroom. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way to her next class. In the hallway, a group of students passed her, laughing loudly. One of them, a tall boy with shaggy hair, deliberately bumped into her shoulder as he walked by. "Watch where you're going," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. Layla didn't respond. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart pounding. During lunch, she sat alone at her usual spot in the back of the cafeteria. She unpacked her food slowly, trying to block out the noise around her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the whispers and laughter that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Look at her," one girl said from a nearby table, "acting like she actually belongs here." Another girl snickered. "It's pathetic, really." Layla pushed her food aside, her appetite gone. She rested her head in her hands, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on her. Later that day, during gym class, things escalated further. The students were playing basketball, and Layla was assigned to a team with Brianna, the girl who had mocked her during volleyball. From the moment the game began, Brianna made it clear that Layla wasn't welcome. She refused to pass the ball to her, instead choosing to hog it herself or pass it to other teammates. When Layla finally got the ball and tried to dribble down the court, Brianna snatched it from her hands. "Don't embarrass us," Brianna hissed, glaring at her. Layla froze, her chest tightening. She wanted to argue, to stand up for herself, but the words caught in her throat. The game ended with their team losing, and Brianna wasted no time pointing the blame at Layla. "Maybe if you'd actually tried," she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. The other students laughed, and Layla felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She quickly turned away and headed for the locker room, her head down. In the quiet of the locker room, Layla sat on a bench, staring at her sneakers. She could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not where they could see her weakness. I can't keep doing this, she thought, her chest aching with frustration and sadness. Why does it feel like the whole world is against me? That evening, Layla struggled to focus on her homework. Her parents, as usual, asked about her day, but she gave them the same rehearsed answer. It was fine, just busy. Her mother frowned, watching her carefully. Are you sure, Layla? You've been so quiet lately. I'm just tired, Layla said quickly, forcing a smile. It's nothing. Her father nodded, but Layla could see the concern in his eyes. She hated lying to them, but she didn't know how to explain what she was going through. They wouldn't understand, she thought. They'd just feel guilty for sending me to Greenwood, and I can't do that to them. That night, as she lay in bed, Layla replayed the day's events over and over in her mind. The laughter, the cruel comments, the dismissive glances, all of it felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. I have to stay strong, she whispered to herself, clutching her blanket tightly. It's going to get better. It has to. But deep down, she wasn't sure how much more she could take. Layla's resolve to endure finally shattered one fateful morning when she arrived at Greenwood High wearing her new braids. She had spent hours with her mother over the weekend perfecting the intricate design, feeling a rare sense of pride in her appearance. These look amazing on you, sweetheart, her mother had said, beaming as she admired her work. For the first time in weeks, Layla felt a flicker of confidence. Her braids were more than a hairstyle. They were a connection to her heritage and a symbol of her identity. But as soon as she stepped into the school, the confidence began to fade. In the hallway, students stared at her, some whispering behind cupped hands, others openly snickering. Seriously? What is she thinking? One girl muttered, loud enough for Layla to hear. Layla kept her head high and pushed through the hall, trying to ignore the comments. She refused to let their words tarnish her pride. When she walked into history class, Mrs. Benson's piercing gaze landed on her immediately. The teacher's expression shifted to one of disapproval, her lips pressing into a thin line. Layla, Mrs. Benson said, her voice sharp. Come up here for a moment. Layla hesitated, clutching the straps of her backpack. Did I do something wrong? She wondered. She stood slowly and made her way to the front of the class, feeling the weight of her classmates' stares. Mrs. Benson looked her over, her eyes lingering on Layla's braids. We've talked about distractions in the classroom, she said coldly. And this, she gestured toward Layla's hair, is a distraction. Layla froze, her heart pounding. My hair isn't distracting anyone, she said softly, her voice trembling. But Mrs. Benson's expression hardened. She reached into her desk and pulled out a pair of scissors, the silver blades glinting under the fluorescent lights. This is not acceptable, Mrs. Benson snapped. If you refuse to fix it, I will. Layla's eyes widened in horror as Mrs. Benson stepped closer, the scissors in her hand. No, please, Layla said, her voice breaking. She instinctively raised her hands to shield her hair, but Mrs. Benson grabbed one of her braids, pulling it taut. Stop, Layla cried, her voice filled with desperation. But Mrs. Benson ignored her. With a swift motion, Mrs. Benson cut through the braid, the sound of the scissors slicing through the hair echoing in the silent classroom. Layla stood frozen in shock as her braid fell to the floor. She felt like a piece of her had been stripped away. Mrs. Benson moved to another braid, her actions cold and mechanical. Layla couldn't move, couldn't speak. Tears blurred her vision as she stood there, powerless to stop what was happening. When Mrs. Benson finally stepped back, Layla's hair was uneven and jagged, the once beautiful braids now lying in a pile on the floor. There, Mrs. Benson said, her tone smug. Now, maybe you'll stop causing disruptions. The room erupted into laughter and whispers. Layla's classmates stared at her, some smirking, others openly jeering. Unbelievable, one boy said, shaking his head. That's what she gets. Layla's hands trembled as she touched her hair, feeling the uneven patches where her braids had been. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she refused to let them see her cry. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos. This is wrong. Layla looked up to see Amelia, one of her few allies in the school, standing up from her desk. You can't just cut someone's hair like that, Amelia said, her voice shaking with anger. That's her choice, her identity. You had no right. Beside her, Ethan and Sophia also stood, their faces set with determination. This isn't about distractions, Ethan added. It's about disrespect. You crossed the line. Sophia folded her arms, glaring at Mrs. Benson. You owe Layla an apology. Mrs. Benson's face turned red with anger. Enough, she shouted. All of you, out of my classroom. Now. Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia gathered their things, standing protectively beside Layla as they left the room. Layla walked silently between them, her shoulders slumped, her heart pounding. She felt humiliated and violated, but also deeply grateful for her friend's support. The hallway felt endless as they made their way to the principal's office. Layla's hands shook as she replayed the scene in her mind, the snip of the scissors, the laughter of her classmates. When they arrived, Principal Harris looked up from his desk, surprised to see them. What's going on? He asked, his brow furrowed. Amelia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. Mrs. Benson just cut off Layla's braids in front of the whole class, she said. She said they were a distraction, but it was humiliating and wrong. Principal Harris's expression darkened as he turned to Layla, taking in her uneven hair and tear-streaked face. Is this true, Layla? He asked quietly. Layla nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. She said my hair was distracting, and then she just cut it. Principal Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. This is a serious allegation, he said. I'll have to speak with Mrs. Benson. But in the meantime, he continued, his tone growing stern, I can't have students disrupting class like this. You'll all need to report for detention after school. Amelia's jaw dropped. Detention? After what she did? Ethan shook his head in disbelief. You're punishing us for standing up for Layla? Principal Harris raised a hand to silence them. This is not up for discussion. Report to detention and I'll address the matter with Mrs. Benson. Layla's heart sank. Once again, she was being punished for simply existing. As they left the office, she felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her. Amelia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. This isn't over, Layla, she said firmly. We'll figure this out. You're not alone. Layla nodded, wiping away a tear. She didn't know how they would fix this, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep enduring this on her own. That evening, Layla sat silently in the passenger seat of her father's car as they drove home from detention. She stared out the window, clutching her backpack tightly, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Her father, Mr. Carter, glanced at her, frowning slightly. You've been quiet all week, Layla, he said gently. And now detention? What's going on? Layla hesitated, her throat tightening as she thought about how to respond. She had been holding everything in for so long, trying to shield her parents from the truth, but the events of the day had pushed her past her breaking point. Finally, she whispered, They hate me, Dad. Her father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Who hates you? What are you talking about? Layla's voice cracked as she tried to explain. The students, the teachers, they all treat me like I don't belong. They make fun of me, push me around, and today? She took a shaky breath. Mrs. Benson cut my braids off in front of the whole class. The car swerved slightly as her father's grip faltered. He quickly pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park before turning to face her. She did what? He asked, his voice low and trembling with barely restrained anger. Layla's eyes filled with tears. She said my hair was a distraction. She grabbed scissors and she just cut them. Mr. Carter's expression shifted from disbelief to outrage. She humiliated you like that? In front of everyone? Layla nodded, her tears now falling freely, and no one stopped her. The principal didn't even care. He gave me detention for standing up for myself. Her father sat back in his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, the car was silent except for the sound of Layla's soft sobs. Then he reached over, gently taking her hand in his. Listen to me, Layla, he said, his voice steady and full of determination. This is not your fault. You didn't deserve any of this, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. But what can we do? Layla asked, her voice small. No one cares. They'll just ignore us like they always do. Her father's eyes blazed with determination. They haven't met me yet. The next morning, Mr. Carter woke early. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, furiously typing as he composed emails and scoured the school district's website for contact information. By 8 a.m., he was on the phone with the school board, refusing to accept vague reassurances or promises of follow-ups. I need to speak to someone in charge, he demanded. This is a serious matter of discrimination and abuse. I won't be brushed aside. After being transferred several times, he finally reached a senior member of the board. Calm but unyielding, Mr. Carter recounted everything Layla had endured, from the dismissive comments to the cruel act of cutting her braids. "This is not just about my daughter's hair," he said firmly. "It's about a systemic culture of discrimination in your school." Mrs. Benson's actions were dehumanizing, and the principal's response was nothing short of negligence. The board member listened in stunned silence before replying. "Mr. Carter, I assure you that we take allegations of this nature very seriously. We will launch a full investigation immediately." "That's not enough," Mr. Carter insisted. "I have witnesses, my daughter's friends, who can confirm what happened. I expect transparency, accountability, and immediate action. This behavior cannot continue." Over the next few days, Mr. Carter worked tirelessly to gather evidence. He met with Layla's friends, Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia, who bravely shared their accounts of what had happened. "We've seen how Mrs. Benson treats Layla," Amelia said during one meeting. "She singles her out all the time, like she's waiting for her to make a mistake. And what she did with the braids? That was crossing the line." Ethan nodded in agreement. "She's been hostile toward Layla from the start, and the principal didn't even care when we told him." Mr. Carter took detailed notes, documenting every incident of harassment and neglect. He compiled a dossier of statements, ready to present them to the school board. Meanwhile, news of the incident began to spread among the Greenwood High community. Some students and parents expressed outrage, while others dismissed it as an overreaction. "She should have just followed the rules," one parent commented during a PTA meeting. "If her hair was a distraction, the teacher had a right to address it." But others were deeply disturbed. "No teacher has the right to humiliate a student like that," another parent argued. "This isn't about rules. It's about respect and basic human decency." As the tension in the community grew, the school board announced an emergency meeting to address the allegations. On the day of the meeting, Mr. Carter and Layla arrived at the district office, joined by Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia, as well as their parents. The room buzzed with whispers as concerned parents and community members filled the seats. When it was Mr. Carter's turn to speak, he stood confidently at the podium, holding the dossier of evidence in his hands. "My daughter Layla came to Greenwood High expecting an opportunity to learn and grow," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Instead, she was met with hostility, cruelty, and humiliation. He recounted the events in detail, his words painting a vivid picture of the injustice Layla had faced. As he spoke, Layla sat quietly beside Amelia, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "She is a bright, resilient young woman who deserves to be treated with dignity," Mr. Carter continued. "But Mrs. Benson's actions and the administration's failure to act have sent a clear message that my daughter's identity is unwelcome here, and that is unacceptable." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by the weight of the evidence presented. "We will conduct a thorough investigation," the chairperson promised, her tone serious. "And we will take appropriate action to ensure that this never happens again." As Layla and her father left the meeting, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Her father's unwavering support and determination reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. "You were amazing in there, Dad," she said softly, squeezing his hand. Mr. Carter smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "This is just the beginning, Layla. They're going to hear us loud and clear." The days following the school board meeting were tense. Greenwood High found itself under intense scrutiny as the investigation into Mrs. Benson's actions began. The school board moved swiftly, interviewing students, reviewing Layla's disciplinary record, and looking into complaints against Mrs. Benson from years prior. Layla kept her head low at school, but the atmosphere around her had shifted. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some students viewed her as brave for standing up to Mrs. Benson, while others saw her as a troublemaker. "She's just blowing things out of proportion," one boy muttered as Layla passed him in the hallway. "Yeah," another added. "Teachers discipline students all the time. Why is she making such a big deal out of it?" Layla tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her few close friends who had stuck by her side. Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia became her constant companions, walking with her between classes and sitting with her at lunch. "It's just noise," Amelia said one afternoon as they ate together. "People are going to talk, but that doesn't mean they're right." Ethan nodded. "Besides, the truth is coming out. They can't hide it forever." As the investigation progressed, more troubling information began to surface. The school board uncovered several incidents in which Mrs. Benson had treated students of color unfairly. "She's had complaints filed against her before," a board member revealed during a follow-up meeting. But they were either dismissed or swept under the rug by the administration. The findings were damning. Interviews with former students revealed a pattern of bias and hostility. One former student, now in college, shared her experience with the board. "She always picked on me," the student said. "If I answered a question wrong, she'd make a big deal out of it, but when other students made mistakes, she'd just move on. I didn't realize how much it affected me until I left Greenwood." Layla's friends also provided testimony. Amelia described the hostile environment in Mrs. Benson's classroom, while Ethan and Sophia recounted the incident with Layla's braids in vivid detail. "She didn't just cut Layla's hair," Ethan said during his interview. "She stripped her of her dignity in front of the entire class. That wasn't about rules, it was about power." The school board also began reviewing Principal Harris's handling of the situation. It became clear that his response had been woefully inadequate. Multiple students and parents came forward with complaints about his dismissive attitude and failure to address issues of discrimination. "He always acted like he was too busy to deal with these problems," one parent said. "But ignoring them didn't make them go away. It just made things worse." As more stories came to light, the community's outrage grew. Parents demanded answers during PTA meetings, and local news outlets picked up the story, further fueling public interest. "This isn't just about one teacher," a concerned parent said during a televised interview. "It's about a culture of negligence that has been allowed to fester for far too long." Meanwhile, Layla found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. She was relieved that the truth was finally being exposed, but the constant attention was overwhelming. "I didn't ask for this," she said one evening, as she sat with her father at the kitchen table. "I just wanted to go to school and be treated like everyone else." Mr. Carter reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, sweetheart, and you deserve that. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing in the spotlight for a little while. It's not fair, but it's necessary." Layla nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. She was proud of the progress they were making, but she couldn't wait for it to be over. The school board held another emergency meeting a week later to present their findings. The atmosphere was tense as parents, students, and faculty packed into the auditorium. The chairperson stepped onto the stage, her expression grim as she addressed the crowd. "Over the past 2 weeks, we have conducted a thorough investigation into allegations of misconduct at Greenwood High," she began. "What we have uncovered is deeply troubling." She detailed the findings: Mrs. Benson's pattern of discriminatory behavior, Principal Harris's repeated failures to address complaints, and the systemic issues that had allowed these problems to persist. "As of today," she continued, "Mrs. Benson has been suspended without pay, pending further disciplinary action. Principal Harris has also been placed on administrative leave." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some parents looked satisfied, while others appeared stunned. "This is just the beginning," the chairperson said firmly. "We are committed to creating a safe, inclusive environment for all students. This will include mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, as well as the establishment of a new reporting system for grievances." As she spoke, Layla sat quietly in the audience beside her father. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, but a small flicker of hope warmed her chest. When the meeting ended, several parents approached Mr. Carter to thank him for his efforts. "You've done something incredible," one mother said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've given all of our kids a voice." Layla overheard their conversation and felt a surge of pride. For the first time in weeks, she felt like her struggles were leading to something meaningful. The next day, the atmosphere at Greenwood High was noticeably different. Mrs. Benson's classroom was empty, and Principal Harris's office door was closed. Students whispered about the investigation, and some even approached Layla to offer tentative words of support. "Hey Layla," one girl said after class, her voice hesitant. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for laughing that day in history. It wasn't right." Layla stared at her surprised before managing a small smile. "Thanks," she said softly. Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia were thrilled by the progress. "This is what change looks like," Amelia said as they sat together at lunch. Ethan nodded. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." For the first time, Layla allowed herself to believe that things might actually get better. The investigation at Greenwood High didn't just expose Mrs. Benson and Principal Harris's actions. It sent shockwaves through the entire community. Conversations about discrimination and accountability erupted everywhere, from school hallways to PTA meetings, uniting parents, students, and educators who wanted to see real change. In response to the outcry, the school board announced several immediate reforms. Among them was the implementation of a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program for all staff, along with the creation of an anonymous reporting system for bullying and discrimination. For too long, issues like this have been ignored or brushed aside, the school board chairperson declared during a press conference. "We are committed to ensuring that every student feels valued and respected." The announcement gave Layla and her friends a sense of hope, but they knew there was still work to be done. "It's a good start," Ethan said one afternoon as they sat in the library working on a group project. "But policies only matter if people actually follow them." Amelia nodded. "Yeah, it's up to us to make sure they don't just sweep this under the rug again." The following week, the school hosted its first ever diversity and inclusion workshop, led by an external counselor with years of experience addressing systemic bias in schools. All students and staff were required to attend, and the sessions focused on empathy, understanding, and the impact of unconscious bias. On the first day of the workshop, the counselor began with a simple exercise. She asked everyone in the room to write down a time when they had felt excluded or judged, then encouraged volunteers to share their experiences. The room was uncomfortably silent at first, but slowly, hands began to rise. A boy in Layla's history class spoke about how his accent had made him a target for jokes when he first moved to the country. A girl from the basketball team shared her frustration at being overlooked because she didn't fit the athletic stereotype. When it was Layla's turn to speak, she hesitated, her palms damp as she clutched the piece of paper in her hand. But then she thought about everything she had been through, the stares, the whispers, the humiliation in Mrs. Benson's classroom, and she knew she had to share her story. Taking a deep breath, she stood up. "I've been treated like I don't belong since the day I walked into this school," she began, her voice trembling but strong. "People laughed at me, ignored me, and judged me because of the way I look. And when I tried to stand up for myself, I was punished for it." The room was completely silent as Layla spoke. Some students looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others seemed genuinely moved. "I didn't want to be the center of attention," Layla continued, "but I realized that if I didn't speak up, nothing would change, and I think we all deserve to feel like we belong here." When she finished, there was a moment of stillness before the counselor spoke. "Thank you for sharing that, Layla," she said warmly. "Your courage is inspiring, and it's a reminder of why this work is so important." As Layla sat back down, Amelia gave her a reassuring smile, and Ethan whispered, "You crushed it." The workshops continued over the next few weeks, gradually shifting the school's atmosphere. Teachers began incorporating discussions about diversity and empathy into their lessons, and students were encouraged to speak out against bullying and discrimination. Layla noticed subtle changes in her classmates as well. Some of the students who had laughed at her in the past now avoided her gaze, clearly embarrassed by their previous behavior. A few even approached her to apologize. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," one boy said after class one day, his voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't realize how much it hurt you." Layla accepted the apology with a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. "It means a lot." The biggest change, however, came in Layla herself. For the first time since starting at Greenwood High, she began to feel like she belonged. With the support of her father and her friends, she found the strength to hold her head high and take pride in who she was. One afternoon, as she walked into history class, she was surprised to see a new teacher standing at the front of the room. "Good morning, everyone," the teacher said with a warm smile. "My name is Miss Rodriguez, and I'll be your new history teacher." Layla exchanged a glance with Amelia, who raised her eyebrows in surprise. Miss Rodriguez wasted no time setting a new tone for the classroom. She encouraged open discussions, praised students for their efforts, and made it clear that respect was non-negotiable. When Layla raised her hand to answer a question, Ms. Rodriguez called on her immediately, nodding encouragingly as she spoke. "Excellent point, Layla," she said when Layla finished. "I can tell you've been thinking deeply about this." Layla felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in months, she felt like her voice mattered. Outside of class, Layla continued to rely on her friends for support. Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia had been with her through the worst of it, and their bond had only grown stronger as they navigated the changes at Greenwood High together. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Sophia said one afternoon as they sat at their usual lunch table. "It feels like a different school," Ethan added, taking a bite of his sandwich. Amelia grinned. "And it's all because of Layla." Layla shook her head, laughing softly. "It's not just me. I couldn't have done any of this without you guys." Amelia draped an arm around her shoulders. "Well, we're not going anywhere. You're stuck with us." As the semester drew to a close, Greenwood High held an assembly to celebrate the progress they had made. The principal introduced the new initiatives and commended the students and staff for their efforts to create a more inclusive environment. When Layla's name was called, she hesitated for a moment before standing up. The applause that followed was deafening, and as she walked to the stage, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. "You've shown incredible resilience and courage," the principal said as he handed her a certificate. "Your voice has made a difference." As Layla looked out at the crowd, she saw her father beaming in the audience, his eyes brimming with tears. "We did it, Dad," she thought, her heart swelling with emotion. "We really did it." As the changes at Greenwood High began to take root, Layla found herself stepping into a version of the school she hadn't thought possible just weeks earlier. The oppressive air that had once filled the hallways seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of acceptance. Layla noticed it in small moments. Her classmates greeted her with nods instead of sneers. Teachers began treating her contributions with the same consideration as anyone else's. Even the cafeteria, once a battlefield of judgmental stares and whispered mockery, became a place where Layla could eat her lunch in peace. "Did you see how Jacob apologized in class today?" Amelia asked one afternoon as the group gathered at their usual lunch table. Layla smiled faintly. "Yeah, I was shocked. I never thought I'd hear those words from him. He looked like he was about to melt from embarrassment," Ethan said, chuckling. "But at least he said something. That's more than a lot of people ever do." Sophia nodded. "It's a start, and honestly, Layla, I think seeing you stand up for yourself has made people realize they can't get away with that kind of behavior anymore." For Layla, the gradual shift in attitudes brought a sense of relief, but also an unexpected surge of confidence. She began speaking up more in class, no longer holding back her thoughts out of fear of ridicule. One day in history, Miss Rodriguez assigned a project on historical figures who fought for social justice. When Layla's turn to present came, she stood at the front of the classroom, her nerves buzzing, but her voice steady. "I chose Rosa Parks," she began, glancing around the room. Her story reminds us that courage doesn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it's about standing or sitting firmly in what you believe is right, even when the world is against you. The classroom was silent as Layla spoke, her classmates hanging on her every word. When she finished, they broke into applause, and Ms. Rodriguez gave her an approving nod. "That was beautifully done, Layla," she said warmly. "You spoke with such conviction. I think Rosa Parks would be proud." Layla returned to her seat, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just at Greenwood High, but within herself. Outside of class, Layla and her friends began noticing even more significant changes. The diversity and inclusion workshops had sparked conversations throughout the school, forcing students and teachers alike to confront their biases. One afternoon, as Layla walked through the hallway, a girl she barely knew stopped her. "Hey, Layla," the girl said, her cheeks flushed. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much you were going through, and I shouldn't have laughed or ignored it." Layla studied the girl's face, seeing the sincerity in her expression. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "It means a lot." The girl smiled hesitantly before walking away, leaving Layla standing there with a newfound sense of closure. She knew not everyone would apologize, and not everyone would change, but she didn't need validation from those who couldn't see her worth. She had her friends, her father, and most importantly, her own strength. The school administration also took meaningful steps to rebuild trust with the student body. The new principal, Dr. Myers, held open forums where students could voice their concerns without fear of dismissal. "We're here to listen," Dr. Myers said during one meeting. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but together we can create a school where everyone feels safe and respected." Layla attended one of the forums with Amelia, Ethan, and Sophia. Hearing other students share their experiences made her realize that she wasn't alone in her struggles. "It's crazy how many people have been holding this in," Ethan said afterward. "But it's also kind of amazing that they're finally speaking out." Amelia nodded. "It feels like we're part of something bigger now, like we're actually making a difference." For Layla, the most powerful moment came during a school assembly near the end of the semester. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students and teachers gathered, curious about what the administration had planned. Dr. Myers took the stage, holding a microphone and a stack of papers. "Today, we want to recognize the resilience and courage of our students," she began, her voice strong but full of warmth. "Especially those who have shown us the importance of standing up for what's right." She called Layla's name, and the room erupted into applause. Layla froze for a moment, her heart pounding, before standing and making her way to the stage. As she accepted the certificate of recognition from Dr. Myers, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about her, it was about every student who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unwelcome. "You've shown us what bravery looks like," Dr. Myers said, her voice filled with admiration. "And because of you, Greenwood High is becoming a better place." Layla looked out at the crowd, spotting her father's beaming face in the audience. Her friends cheered loudly from their seats, their smiles wide with pride. "Thank you," Layla said into the microphone, her voice steady. "I didn't do this alone. I had the support of my dad, my friends, and everyone who believed that we could do better. This isn't just my story, it's ours, and I hope it inspires all of us to keep fighting for what's right." The applause that followed was deafening, and as Layla stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since arriving at Greenwood High. The final weeks of the semester passed quickly, and by the time the year ended, Greenwood High felt like a different place. New teachers brought fresh energy to the classrooms, and the administration worked hard to repair the fractured trust of the students and parents. Layla, once hesitant to walk the school's hallways, now strode confidently between classes, greeting classmates and teachers with a smile. At lunch, she and her friends often reflected on how far they had come. "This school isn't perfect," Amelia said one day, her tone thoughtful, "but it's a lot better than it was." Layla nodded, "And it'll keep getting better, as long as we don't stop pushing." Ethan grinned. "Well, if anyone can keep them in check, it's you." Layla laughed, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time, she looked forward to what lay ahead. As the school year drew to a close, Layla couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed, not just in Greenwood High but within herself. The girl who had once walked through the halls with her head down, dreading every interaction, was now someone who spoke with confidence and held her ground. Her transformation hadn't been easy, and the scars of her experiences lingered. But those challenges had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who believed in her right to be respected. On the last day of school, Layla stood outside the auditorium, clutching her backpack tightly. Inside, the staff and students were gathered for an end-of-year celebration, an event to recognize the accomplishments of the school community and the progress they had made. As she walked in, her father, Mr. Carter, waved to her from the back of the room. He had insisted on attending, proud as ever of his daughter's resilience and courage. "Don't forget," he said before she left the house that morning, "you're not just showing up for yourself, you're paving the way for others." The thought had stayed with Layla all day. The ceremony began with speeches from the new principal, Dr. Myers, and the school board chairperson. They spoke about the steps Greenwood High had taken to address its shortcomings, including mandatory diversity training, the new reporting system, and a renewed commitment to equity and inclusion. But the moment that stood out most to Layla came when Dr. Myers called her name. "Today," Dr. Myers said, her voice ringing through the auditorium, "we want to recognize a student whose bravery and determination have inspired change, not just in our school, but in our entire community. Layla Carter, please join me on stage." The applause was thunderous as Layla made her way to the stage. Her legs trembled slightly, but she kept her head high, her father's words echoing in her mind. When she reached the podium, Dr. Myers handed her a plaque engraved with the words, "For courage and resilience, Layla Carter." "You've shown us what it means to stand up for what's right," Dr. Myers said, her tone filled with admiration. "Your courage has made Greenwood High a better place, and we're proud to honor you today." Layla took the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She looked out at the crowd, her father, her friends, and her classmates, and took a deep breath. "I didn't expect any of this when I first came to Greenwood High," she began. "Honestly, I just wanted to fit in. But when I realized that wasn't possible, I knew I had to stand up, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always easy. But when we work together, when we listen to each other and support each other, we can create something better. I'm proud of what we've accomplished this year, and I hope it's just the beginning." The applause that followed was deafening. As Layla stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of pride that she couldn't quite put into words. Bookmark. After the ceremony, Layla and her friends gathered in the courtyard, enjoying the warm afternoon sun. "Did you see how the entire room was clapping for you?" Amelia said, grinning. "You're officially a legend." Layla laughed. "I don't know about that, but it felt good. Like maybe all of this was worth it." Sophia nodded. "It definitely was. Look at this school, it's completely different now." Ethan leaned back against the bench, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, but it's up to us to keep it that way. Change isn't permanent unless people keep pushing for it." Layla smiled at him, grateful for his honesty. "You're right, but we've shown that it's possible, and that's a good start." As the afternoon went on, more students came up to Layla to congratulate her. Some shared how her story had inspired them to speak out about their own struggles. "I never thought anyone would listen," one girl admitted. "But when I saw what you did, I realized maybe I could say something too." Layla's heart swelled with emotion. She hadn't set out to become a role model, but knowing that her actions had made a difference filled her with a deep sense of purpose. That evening, as Layla and her father drove home, the familiar sight of Greenwood High fading into the distance, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. "You did it, Layla," her father said, his voice full of pride. "You took something painful and turned it into something powerful." Layla glanced at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We did it, Dad. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He reached over and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll always stand by you, Layla. Always." Over the summer, Layla took time to reflect on the year and everything it had taught her. She realized that the fight for respect and inclusion didn't end with Greenwood High. There were still challenges to face, still battles to fight, but she felt ready to take them on. She spent her days volunteering at a local community center, sharing her story with younger students and encouraging them to stand up for themselves. "Your voice matters," she told them during one session. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The experience gave her a renewed sense of purpose. By the time the next school year began, Greenwood High had undergone a transformation. New teachers brought fresh energy to the classrooms, and the administration had implemented programs designed to foster a culture of respect and understanding. Layla walked through the halls with a confidence she hadn't known before. She no longer felt the need to shrink herself to fit in. Instead, she held her head high, knowing she had earned her place. Her friends remained by her side, their bond stronger than ever. Together, they continued to advocate for change, ensuring that the progress they had made wouldn't be undone. "I'm proud of you, Layla," Amelia said one afternoon as they walked to class. Layla smiled. "Thanks, but I'm proud of all of us. We did this together." On a crisp autumn morning, Layla stood in front of Greenwood High's main entrance, looking up at the building with a sense of accomplishment. This is just the beginning, she thought, her heart swelling with determination. There's so much more to do, but I'm ready for it. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of Layla Carter is one of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up against injustice. It shines a light on the challenges faced by those who are often marginalized and the profound impact of having a support system that believes in you. Layla's journey reminds us that change is not easy, nor is it instant. It requires strength, unity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Greenwood High transformed not just because of Layla's bravery, but because others joined her in the fight. From her father's unwavering determination to the loyalty of her friends, and even the eventual accountability of the school board, each piece was crucial in creating a culture of respect and inclusion. This story is a testament to the importance of speaking out, listening, and taking action, lessons that resonate far beyond the walls of a school. As viewers, we are reminded of the value of standing up for what is right, even when it feels impossible. Layla's story challenges us to reflect on our own actions and biases, encouraging us to build environments where everyone feels seen, valued, and respected. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Let us know about your own experiences, what challenges you have faced, and how you have overcome them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear from you.